Hello, today is November 28th, 2014. My name's Jason Ross, and you're joining us for our regular Friday evening LaRouche PAC webcast. I'm joined in the studio tonight by Megan Beats of the LaRouche PAC Science Team and by Dennis Small of Executive Intelligence Review. We've been in discussion with Mr. LaRouche over the past couple of days, and the responses and discussion that you'll hear tonight will be reflecting that. We'll start with our institutional question of this evening, which reads as follows. Mr. LaRouche, we would like your assessment of the recent events in Ferguson, Missouri. As you know, the local grand jury concluded that there was no basis for handing down a criminal indictment against the police officer who shot and killed a black youth. This resulted in several days of rioting, the calling out of the National Guard, and protest demonstrations around the country. What is your assessment of these events, and how do you assess the underlying factors, the response by the Obama administration, the media, and other public officials? What can be done to better handle such situations between local law enforcement and communities in the future? And I'd like to ask Dennis Small to respond to this question.
Thanks, Jason, and good evening. What Mr. LaRouche said is that what can be done to better handle these type of situations is to get Obama out of the White House, get rid of Obama. Because we now have a situation which is spinning out of control, and Obama as president is responsible to protect the nation from this type of unnecessary conflict. He said that if we remove Obama, we do have a chance to solve the problem. There are professional military people, there are professional law enforcement officers and others who know how to deal with this type of a situation without shooting, or only if there is an absolute requirement and there's no other way to handle it. What you have to do is you have to surround and isolate the problem, and you have to solve it with minimum damage. And there are professionals who know how to do this. Obama is not, and he is the problem who must be removed so that we can address this and many other problems. Mr. LaRouche said also that there is, in the case of Ferguson, probably something else going on around this. Something else that is actually provoking it. He added that it's important to look at what is happening on the Obama question if you just look at what's happening economically. He said, look at the economic conditions which Obama has created and which he has aggravated with Wall Street's dictated policies. How many people are unemployed because of Obama? How many people have been deprived of their rights because of Obama? Look at the galloping danger of thermonuclear war with Russia and China because of what Obama is doing on behalf of the British Empire. And all because of his brinksmanship in places like Ukraine, which is very important to look at to understand how this process is proceeding. So it's urgent to throw Obama out of the presidency, Mr. LaRouche said. And he added that it's also urgent to throw out the younger Bush and everything he represents. That, Mr. LaRouche said, is a truly bipartisan approach. Now, if you look at what has gone on over the last month leading into this immediate situation, look back to the November 4th midterm elections, where Obama was obliterated politically. He was politically impeached, and within 2 days, on November 6th, Mr. LaRouche issued an international public call for a kind of Thanksgiving massacre to be carried out in the Obama cabinet. Thanksgiving was an outside date, and the policy, the idea was that people like Valerie Jarrett and Susan Rice and people of that sort had to be removed. This was the inner core controlling and controlled by the British Empire, but controlling Obama's actions, which were prohibiting and getting in the way of competent professionals from actually carrying out policies in American interests. So that's what Mr. LaRouche called for, was a Thanksgiving massacre, politically speaking. Just a few days after that, on November 10th and 11th, the APEC summit meeting was held in China, in which Obama participated and was in fact quite irrelevant to the fundamental proceedings that were going on there, which was the discussion of how the BRICS-led dynamic for win-win cooperation in economics and security matters was discussed with an ever-broadening layer of the population of the planet. And that APEC meeting is also where the Chinese president, Xi Jinping, at a press conference on November 12th, with a very uncomfortable President Obama standing at his side, Xi Jinping offered the United States to join in these efforts at development, such as those the BRICS are carrying out. An offer which, of course, Mr. LaRouche has repeatedly emphasized is in the fundamental interest of the United States and of all the countries of the world. But Obama would have none of it. His British masters would have none of it. And in fact, the Wall Street Journal went so far as to accuse Xi Jinping of trying to out-American the Americans by presenting a Marshall Plan for global development. So that was up to November 10th, 11th, 12th. Then on November 24th, just a couple of days ago, the Thanksgiving massacre, which LaRouche politically had called for, was not carried out, but in fact quite the contrary. Defense Secretary Hagel was removed from the cabinet by Obama on instructions from this witches' coven which surrounds him, including Jared and Susan Rice, and I guess they're the representatives of the chief witch herself, the Queen of England. But Hagel was out. He was unceremoniously removed, despite the fact that he had, or actually because of the fact that he had been representing the views of competent military thinkers, such as in the Joint Chiefs of Staff, who were appalled by and opposed to the Obama administration's efforts to get the United States involved in yet another war with the risk of leading directly into a thermonuclear confrontation. Now, at the point that that happened, the Hagel removal, Mr. LaRouche emphasized that Hagel's removal had to become a rallying point for all sane Democrats and Republicans to join in removing Obama. They have to take a public stand, he said. The time to act for the sake of the nation and all of mankind has arrived. He said we may be weeks away from the danger of a thermonuclear war because of the policies which Obama is implementing, and there is no other way to guarantee that we will avoid that war and consequent extermination other than ousting Obama from office. Now, in discussions yesterday, Mr. LaRouche had a very interesting additional point to emphasize on this, which is that New York, and New York City in particular, is taking up the discussion that Washington is evading, and that New York alone has the clout to sink most of Congress and certainly lead the way in sinking Obama. What he said is that the Democratic Party, the Democrats are confused, the Republicans are not working, and there is chaos otherwise, and so therefore Obama is still controlling the process. Now, there are people who say that Americans still defend Obama, and Mr. LaRouche wished that that be clarified tonight. He said that is not quite true. Only stupid people and crooks defend Obama. And that includes Wall Street, although Wall Street is so bad and so crooked that they give a bad name to honest thieves.
Well, as Dennis remarked, over the past months, LaRouche has been putting an increasing importance on New York City and on the work that the LaRouche PAC has been doing in Manhattan. Speaking about the power of New Yorkers to have their own thoughts, not to listen to Washington or to the Congress, and to create the clout to remove Obama. So for the program tonight, Mr. LaRouche wanted us to go straight to the source. And the next question will be posed to a couple of our colleagues who are leading up the LaRouche PAC work in Manhattan, Elliot Greenspan and Daniel Burke. So the question to you, gentlemen, is could you tell us about the significance of Manhattan? Could you tell us about the approach that you're taking to the organizing there? And could you help us understand more about LaRouche's outlook on the matter?
It'll be our pleasure. On June 15th of this year, in the heart of Manhattan, Helga Zepp LaRouche, founder of the Schiller Institute, convened an emergency conference on the theme, "It is time for a world without war." Can we put up that slide? Yes. Mrs. LaRouche insisted that the conference be in New York City to maximize the international impact of a collection of prominent personalities joining the LaRouche movement to derail the British Obama escalation of thermonuclear war. You see here Helga with former U.S. Attorney General Ramsey Clark at that conference, to be joined by Ray McGovern, the founder of the Veteran Intelligence Professionals for Sanity, by the Chinese leader Colonel Bao, among others. A month later, July 15, July 16, in Fortaleza, Brazil, the summit of the BRICS nations launched an international revolution based on the economic scientific principles of New Yorkers Alexander Hamilton, Franklin Roosevelt, and Lyndon LaRouche. This American system revolution, building dramatically over these last months, is the unique key to peace through economic development. This process is the strategic setting for Lyndon LaRouche's Manhattan Project. That is, we here are transforming the noetic capability and the political fighting passion of the soul of the nation, of New York City, with the historic mission of bringing the U.S. into the BRICS revolution and out of the control of the Brits, of the British Empire, and the Obama fascist operation. I'm joined here by Daniel Burke, who, with me and others, has led this project over an extended period, and we will very briefly take up Jason's question. First, I want to reference Mr. LaRouche's discussion of Monday of this week with the LaRouche PAC Policy Committee. He said the New York City area is and was the center of the United States in terms of the policy in the history of the United States. Other places were important, but without Manhattan, there was nothing to pull them together. And this was the case beginning with our most famous statesman, Alexander Hamilton. Hamilton was a New Yorker. He goes on, he says, and this is Lynn's focus, that the situation is not, he said, a hopeless one. The issue is, can we muster the forces inside the United States and beyond which will represent a voice for sanity? And what we're lacking, the citizens are so intimidated for fear of being marked out, for being attacked. They're afraid. If they think they have some unity in defending their policy, what they want, what they think, and open their voice to the world, then we can break through. New York City is the leading opportunity to break through. That is, New York does not obey the Congress. It has its own mind, Lynn says. And therefore, what we have to do is essentially get the mind of the citizens to begin to come out from behind the place where it's hiding, because they really don't like any of this stuff. And he goes on in the same discussion that the city of New York now is the one point in the United States where you can actually create the intellectual revolution as a political revolution in Manhattan, in the immediate city, in the areas which are affected by it. And that can be the place where you arouse the kind of leadership you need to win the struggle against evil. He then emphasized in that discussion Monday, and I urge people to go back on the LaRouche PAC website and review the entire policy committee discussion, and achievements of China, of India, of the BRICS. But he said we need New York City as the keystone, as the spark plug, as an essential element of inclusion to pull the U.S. together, to marry, so to speak, the BRICS. That is, the groom needs a bride. We are the bride in this country, but that depends on a quality of passion, of inspiration, which is coming uniquely from New York City. In a minute, Daniel will elaborate the process that's unfolded. But in subsequent discussion, Mr. LaRouche stressed this passion, this devotion to the future of mankind, which you see from the Indian leadership, from the Chinese leadership, from the BRICS heads of state, from the BRICS nations. Much as New York is the international city, the melting pot, the unique quality of melting pot, bringing together hundreds of nationalities to work for the general welfare and the future of America. In that subsequent discussion, Lynn poses this, I think, in a very important way. He talks about the scientist. He says, what's the objective of the scientist? To discover something? Not really. Not a good good scientist, no. The scientist thinking in himself which he suspects might be there. And he's never been able to get right before. Because it's mankind seeking to find out what mankind can become that is latent in mankind. That's what's important. And all racists get really rubbed out on that one. There's no such thing as racial specificity. The human race is what it can become, not what it is. That's the lesson that we're dealing with here. The best people in Manhattan all have an experience in this. Typical people throughout the rest of the nation generally don't. And people flood to Manhattan because it's there. I think on the screen, do we see Federal Hall? It started with Hamilton, whose 4 reports of 1790-91 as President Washington's Treasury Secretary created the American system of physical economy. You take the one idea in the report on manufacturers which captures this: to cherish and stimulate the activity of the human mind by multiplying the objects of enterprise is not among the least considerable of expedients by which the wealth of a nation may be promoted. You're looking at Federal Hall, the statue of George Washington in front of the hall, the seat of Washington's government. Down the street, Hamilton created the National Bank. Across the street from this is the House of Morgan. But the empire's response, next slide, the empire's response to Hamilton, the British agent Aaron Burr murdering Hamilton. Abraham Lincoln came to New York City, really had to come in the 1860 presidential campaign. This is Lincoln standing 3 hours or so before his famous Cooper Union speech to make this crucial speech where he emphasized that the Founding Fathers opposed slavery. That with Hamilton, he knew that the future was based on the people and their right to develop, not Wall Street money. With Emma Lazarus's poem on the Statue of Liberty, we have this, there we go, the Statue of Liberty. Give me your tired, your poor, your huddled masses yearning to breathe free, the wretched refuse of your teeming shore. Send these, the homeless, tempest-tossed to me. I lift my lamp beside the golden door. That with the Statue of Liberty, with Ellis Island, that New York not just opened itself to tens of millions of people coming from various sections of Europe and beyond, but welcomed them, encouraged them, transformed the world, transformed the nation. I think between 1895 and 1905, there were 9 million immigrants in that period alone. That the principle of New York, what Mr. LaRouche is posing as the soul of New York, the soul of the nation, is this recognition from Hamilton, through Ellis Island, through our movement, that the wealth, the real wealth, is the people and their right and their capacity for creative development, their mind. That this is the principle of New York, this is the soul, the secret, the magic of New York, of the United States. Franklin Roosevelt, New Yorker Franklin Roosevelt, welcomed the hatred of the economic royalists. Famous speech in 1936 during that presidential campaign. That the Wall Street economic royalists were his enemy, were the enemy of that principle of New York and of the nation. And he applied the principles of Hamilton to uplift the nation out of the Great Depression. When the empire killed President Kennedy and U.S. Senator Robert Kennedy of New York, Lyndon LaRouche organized a movement of a revolutionary intelligentsia, an early youth movement, but revolutionary intelligentsia in New York City. Next. Lyndon LaRouche debating Abel Lerner, December 1971, in that famous debate, which was crucial in the development and transformation of our movement. And soon thereafter, Mr. LaRouche launched the international campaign for world development, which has now exploded with the BRICS. Next. And I'm turning this over to Daniel.
Well, I think the idea here is to go through what's been done in Manhattan from the standpoint of what must be done, and not just for Manhattan in terms of the program that we have been working on, especially accelerating in the recent weeks, but in terms of what must be done that can radiate across the country. And so I want to describe the series of conferences that we have held in Manhattan. It dates back to what Elliot initiated this with, which was the June conference that we held entitled "The World Without War," which Mrs. Helga Zepp LaRouche called for and then brought to bear in a fantastic way. Could you move it to the next one? So if you could put the slide up, you'll see some of the figures who are in this process in Manhattan and what significance it is to have them in here. So obviously at the top is Helga herself. And then below that you can see Colonel Bao, who is of the People's Liberation Army, who spoke passionately about the role of Helga and Lyndon LaRouche in authoring and providing for the policy of the New Silk Road at our conference. Please go on to the next one. Then you have Ramsey Clark, who has made repeated appearances at our events. Former United States Attorney General, Manhattanite to the core. And below him you see Ray McGovern, former CIA analyst and founder, incredibly brave man, founder of the Veteran Intelligence Professionals for Sanity. Keep going. There are many other people to mention that came into this. I actually had a slide that didn't come across of former Congressman Neil Gallagher and of the remarkable Terry Strada, who you'll see later in the slideshow. But really, I think what's interesting about the events more than anything, obviously you're bringing in all these incredible people from the environs, from Manhattan as such, but it's the interesting thing is what happens to the audiences that come in. And these audiences are growing. They're growing every week in Manhattan. But what happens is that people come in and they're confronted with beauty, and they're confronted with something sublime. And most importantly, I think through the classical musical performances that we've been able to put together and that we've been fortunate enough to have at our events, what they have, what it forces an individual to confront is that they're part of something bigger than what they ever thought they were a part of. They're part of something that can work. And I think that, you know, it's a thing it's almost impossible to talk about because, of course, you have to sit through a moment and be challenged yourself to find within yourself what is missing within society. And that's what's been successful. So I'll take us up to, this is a process of conferences that goes back to June. Then we've had a remarkable event on the 11th of October in Harlem, which was focused on releasing the 28 pages where the very courageous Terry Strada spoke. We had an event November 9th on the 25th anniversary of the fall of the wall. We had an event just recently on the 22nd, which was also quite remarkable, focused on and this actually happened on the 51st anniversary of the assassination of Kennedy. But then we come into September, basically. I mean, that's where I want to bring you next. Here in September, what you see on the screen is the Hall of the United Nations General Assembly. And it's in September that the LaRouche organization begins this, I think, just remarkable orientation, organizing process in the Manhattan area with the UN diplomats, foreign journalists, foreign businessmen, students, every type that come rushing up and down 2nd Avenue in this time of the year. And what was, you know, the the summer was ending, and the fall is coming in, but it was not the fall that the British expected, because what happened was that you had the UN was intended, this General Assembly once again intended to be a British operation to crush the BRICS in their infancy. Obama came in fitted with the Ukraine developments, attempting to use the Ukraine situation to escalate for war, but instead, the BRICS arrived on the scene as a coordinated force in a war footing. And between the speeches of Brazilian President Dilma Rousseff and the President of Argentina, Cristina Fernandez de Kirchner, and the Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi, you could see that Obama's face started to look a bit dyspeptic. So it's at this point that the LaRouche movement activities in Manhattan, I think that they really began to take off in a completely different way. I think this is something Mr. LaRouche is talking about, because we stood, I think we stood prepared, we stand prepared today to answer and define and to amplify the inspiration and the passion of these BRICS leaders and of these nations. So I was fortunate enough to experience for myself the quality of mass optimism, which is present and was present in this crowd of 20,000 Indian Americans who thronged 7th Avenue, more than 20,000 in fact, and they thronged 7th Avenue in an effort to participate in Narendra Modi's address at Madison Square Garden, where Franklin Roosevelt had spoken in 1936 so effectively. And we greeted Modi, our organizers, and we greeted those who came with him as leaders of humanity, who were rallied around an anti-oligarchical conception of man by the principle of leadership. So that no longer, after Modi, no longer will Indians regard their huge population as a burden on the nation, as how unfortunate that there's so many weighing down the rest of us. People coming out of this event said explicitly, that's what I believed before I walked in the door. But now I realize through the teachings of Modi that every human mind that we bring into our population is an addition to Mother India's wealth, which is the Hamiltonian tradition. That's the principle that Eliot went through. So I think that it's at that event, I think it's that event in Manhattan that really helped trigger the next phase of the organizing, our building process of conferences. Because at this point, we find ourselves confronted with the challenge. Mr. LaRouche has made it very clear. Are we going to exert triumph in the BRICS, or are we going to let our people waste time complaining about the collapse of the United States? And so we fought on this. We fought on this on Wall Street, yards from Hamilton's grave. We fought on this at Bellevue Hospital, at the center of at Rockefeller Center, amidst the worst of international media, and everywhere where we can revive the spirit of Manhattan, which I think is really captured in this picture. Because you see our organizers presenting the only thing that can possibly change history at this point, which is a rallying around the principle that mankind is not an animal, but that in fact we are a creative species. So this is the fight that all patriots have to join. I think it's clear on the basis of what Mr. LaRouche has been doing and what we've been able to present here tonight. This is the Hamilton fight. This is the Franklin Roosevelt fight. This is the LaRouche fight. And this will radiate across the nation, and it'll radiate across the world if we refuse to lose concentration. That's clear. And this is an image from our very recent conference, the 22nd, where the second from the left, you can see Terry Strada, the co-founder of the 9/11 Families United for Justice Against Terrorism. And she absolutely typifies, and the response of the audience to her typifies what we have to deal with here, which is a courage to initiate, to really initiate the revolution, to stand for the revolution, which is an intellectual revolution that uniquely we're capable of beginning here in Manhattan, fighting for. And it's that intellectual revolution that will allow a political revolution. So here's an image of some of our New York organizers, not nearly all of them, but many of our people here at the statue of Schiller on the occasion of the 255th birthday of Friedrich Schiller. At the top of his head, you can see a little laurel wreath that's been placed on top of his head with some acrobatics involved, and this typifies what passion we have to bring in this moment. So let me just end this presentation by calling for the proper passion for the December 13th event that we're doing here in Manhattan, which is entitled Alexander Hamilton's Bricks Can Save the United States of America. And that will take place on Saturday, December 13th, so everyone should come.
Good. That's good. Well, excellent advice. I certainly hope plenty of people are able to make it. Thanks a lot, guys. Thanks for that report. Well, we're going to move ahead to our next series of questions, and I'd like to ask Megan Beets to pose the following one.
Thanks, Jason. So I'd like to go back to a topic which Dennis raised in his answer to the first question, where he referred to the firing of Defense Secretary Hagel and the insane push by the British and the Obama administration to go for all-out war and provocation against Russia, against China, and frankly against most of the world, which was initiated roughly a year ago when the actions begun in Ukraine. Now, Russia has been very vocal on the fact that the so-called color revolutions, such as the one run in Ukraine, which deposed the elected government to bring Nazis to power in Kiev, these color revolutions are nothing but a new mode of warfare. Now, this was stated very clearly by President Putin at the end of October in his speech to the Valdai International Discussion Club, where he said, quote, "The measures taken against those who refuse to submit," referring to nations such as Russia, "are well known and have been tried and tested many times. They include the use of force, economic and propaganda pressure, meddling in domestic affairs, and appeals to a kind of supra-legal legitimacy when they need to justify illegal intervention in this or that conflict, or toppling inconvenient regimes." End quote. Now, this criticism was reiterated on November 22nd by Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov, speaking to the Council on Foreign and Defense Policy in Moscow, where he said, quote, "They went all out in Ukraine and supported extremists, thereby giving up their own principles of democratic regime change. What came out of it was an attempt to play chicken with Russia, to see who blinks first. As bullies say, they wanted Russia to chicken out, to force us to swallow the humiliation of Russians and native speakers of Russian in Ukraine." End quote. Now, again, this same condemnation of the West came from Russian Deputy Defense Minister Anatoly Antonov earlier this week at an Asian security conference being held in Colombo, Sri Lanka, where Antonov delivered very strong remarks accusing the United States of driving Ukraine to civil war by supporting the unconstitutional coup of last February. He added that the ongoing protests in Hong Kong very much resemble the protests of the Maidan. He warned of the danger of so-called color revolutions, which are, quote, "destabilizing the situation in one or the other region of the world," end quote. Antonov said that such protests are organized by Western political strategists who are taking advantage of, quote, "socioeconomic difficulties and the presence of various conflicts on ethnic and religious grounds. Under the guise of spreading democracy, they throw populist slogans into the fire of popular discontent, provoking mass protests," end quote. So Dennis, what I'd like to ask you to elaborate on is, what does all of this add up to strategically, and how do these color revolutions work?
Well, the first part of the question was one of the topics that we discussed directly with Mr. LaRouche. And what he said is that if you take the case of Ukraine, you can see exactly what the strategic significance of these color revolutions are. Because what happened in Ukraine is that a pro-Nazi coup was carried out. This was back last February of this year. It was carried out by the British and by Obama. The person sent to the scene to deal with this was Victoria Nuland, and the government that she set up came to be known as Victoria's Secret Government. And this was all done, incidentally, with ample support from Germany's Angela Merkel, who has continued to play an absolutely horrible role on the question of Ukraine, and because of the significance of Ukraine, in terms of provocations and poking a finger in the eye directly of the Russians. Mr. LaRouche says it's all very clear now when you look back at what has happened. A pro-Nazi movement was put in control in Kiev, and that simply has to be removed before anything can actually be negotiated. That movement must be ousted and removed. They have to be removed. Then you can start to talk seriously. And he said that the fascist problem in Ukraine is the problem that has to be dealt with, that element in particular, and that various European organizations and governments are responsible for this, along with the British and Obama. Now, to just give people an idea of where this provocation has gone to, how far it has gone, I would like to mention two recent developments over this week around Ukraine. First, we had a vote that was taken at the United Nations General Assembly. It was a resolution that was presented by the Russian government. It is a resolution which calls for countries to stand in opposition to the return of Nazism and the promotion of pro-Nazi rhetoric. You would think that this is like voting for motherhood and apple pie. But no, there were 3 countries that voted against the resolution, which was denouncing the return of pro-Nazi propaganda. Those countries were the United States, Ukraine, and Canada. Now, many, if not most, of the nations of Europe actually abstained from the vote, which is as immoral as those that voted against the resolution, as far as I'm concerned. But you can see where this is all going. The argument from the State Department was ridiculous. Basically, it was the Russians don't really mean it, so we're not going to vote for it. And here the Russians are trying to find common ground with the United States on the issue of combating Nazism, as we did join forces during World War II under Roosevelt's leadership to combat Nazism. That is nothing that Obama is prepared to accept in any shape or form whatsoever. Then a second development from this week, which I think is worth mentioning because it points to the extraordinary danger of this situation leading to a direct thermonuclear confrontation, as Mr. LaRouche has been insisting all along, i.e. that the purpose of the Ukrainian conflict, the reason it was triggered, was not Ukraine, it was not Europe, it had nothing to do with those specific situations. It was in order to intentionally provoke a confrontation and to torment Russia and China into making mistakes which would then escalate into a strategic confrontation. Now, what happened during this past week with the visit of Joe Biden, Vice President Joe Biden to Ukraine, is that as he arrived in stating support for the government in Kiev, the Kiev government denounced Russia for launching cross-border artillery attacks into Ukraine, something which the Russians denied, and as with many of these accusations, no evidence whatsoever has been presented. But right at the point where the Ukrainians were making that denunciation of the Russians, the United States government announced that it was shipping and had already shipped 3 out of 20 intended counter-mortar radar systems to Ukraine. Now, our government says that it is not shipping military aid to Ukraine. This is non-lethal. Well, technically, yes. In reality, no. Because what counter-mortar radar does, as the Pentagon statement stated explicitly, is that it allows you to trace the origin of the arriving mortar rounds and to target them directly in retaliation. Now, just think for a second. The Ukrainian government has just said there are attacks coming from Russia with no evidence. The United States has provided non-lethal counter-mortar radar equipment. And the United States government is backing Kiev totally in its confrontation with Russia. This is clearly one of numerous situations which could have and may still explode into the kind of strategic confrontation which the British Empire desires. Now, the target of these kinds of operations, and the Kiev operation was a color revolution to be sure, is the objective, the strategic purpose of this is exactly as Megan was just mentioning, the Russians have said. It is a new form of warfare. This was stated specifically in a conference of military and security leaders of Russia and China a number of months back, where they jointly stated that what is in fact behind the color revolution is a new form of warfare. Now, most recently, the Russian foreign minister, Sergei Lavrov, in fact, on November 22nd, said exactly what he thought this was all about and what the view of the Russian government is. He said, and I quote, "The West is making clear it does not want to force Russia to change policy, but wants to secure regime change. Now, public figures in Western countries say there is a need to impose sanctions that will destroy the economy and cause public protests." Close quote. So the clearly recognized intention here is regime change, which in common language is called overthrowing the government. So unless you're prepared to go to nuclear war, overthrowing the government of China or of Russia is not a very wise course of action. And that's the kind of provocation which is in fact coming with the Obama administration, and one of the crucial reasons why Mr. LaRouche has reiterated once and again that we must remove Obama from the White House in order to bring the world back from the brink of a threatened thermonuclear war. Now, in terms of how these colored revolutions function, to sort of take a little bit of an X-ray of these operations, I want to mention a second example besides the Ukraine one. And that's the situation in Mexico. Because Mexico has been targeted by the British and Wall Street for decades now, going all the way back to the period when López Portillo, president of Mexico, working with Lyndon LaRouche, came very close to establishing a new international economic order of exactly the sort that the BRICS are now in the process of building, and which is well underway. So Mexico was attacked. It was cracked section by section, culminating in 2009 with an election in the northern state of Sonora, which was, of course, no election whatsoever, because with drug money, the candidate of the PAN party was imposed. And this is, of course, the kind of model of democracy which the authors of the Colored Revolution have always been seeking for. In fact, the National Endowment for Democracy, otherwise known as Project Democracy, which is one of the oldest operations involved in these colored revolutions, had previously stated with regard to Mexico that the proof of democracy in Mexico will come only when the government of the PRI is overthrown. That's their definition of democracy. So, of course, no problem when the drug money was used to make sure that in the state of Sonora, the clear winner of that election, who was going to walk away with the election, was defeated by a candidate with backing from interests related to the drug trade. So that's the kind of thing that has happened in Mexico. Now, a whole huge explosion has been triggered in Mexico with protest movements over student teachers who disappeared and were probably massacred, with scandals with regard to President Peña Nieto, all because Peña Nieto has indeed made something of a turn towards exploring the possibility of linking up with the BRICS and with China in particular. Now, the way these things work, let me just parenthetically state before returning to finish the point on Mexico. As in the case of Mexico, probably 95% of the people out in the street are honest, well-meaning, naive, romantic cannon fodder. People who are protesting over very real circumstances and difficulties and economic problems and so on. They don't run the show. Those are the people who are being led around by the nose without knowing it by, say, 3 or 4% that is the money coming from the NGOs, Project Democracy, and these groups that are used to steer this in the direction, as the Russians have claimed, of overthrowing a government, a new form of warfare. They're the ones that provide the political leadership and take these romantic, well-meaning, but completely docile masses to create a, quote, mass revolution. But there's one missing factor in all of this which has to be taken into account. You need the commandos, you need the sharpshooters, you need the hitmen, you need the actual small number of Nazis that are prepared to kill on both sides to trigger violence. And the model in the case of Mexico was the 1968 Tlatelolco incident, where it subsequently was discovered that it was a third force, a British-sponsored third force of sharpshooters on rooftops in the area who indiscriminately shot both student protesters and the military that were there to contain the demonstration, therefore unleashing total chaos. That's the kind of way this thing works. So that history is not made by the masses in the streets or something like that. It's made in a policy fight of certain forces run by the British who intentionally want to destroy nations and sovereignty and impose a policy of depopulation versus those who have a leadership idea, such as what was discussed around New York, which is an actual solution to the crisis that's being faced. Today, in the case of Mexico, we face a very interesting situation, which is that the president of Mexico, Peña Nieto, has not crumbled under the pressure. And in a very important speech yesterday, he said the solution to the crisis in Mexico and the protests is, besides the necessary security measures, policies of economic development for Mexico. And he ticked off 3, what he called special economic zones, where particular attention would be paid for development. One is the port of Lázaro Cárdenas on the west coast of Mexico, which was an old project of López Portillo's. A second is the port of Chiapas port in the extreme southeast of Mexico. And the third is the development of the industrial corridor and the Trans-Isthmus rail line crossing the Isthmus of Tehuantepec, which is an old project of López Portillo's and one of the projects which is currently under discussion between Mexico and China. So the point here is that the British are desperate to use colored revolutions and the danger and the threat of war to stop the creation of a new world order, which is in fact being created by the BRICS and associated nations. And that strategic conflict, that issue over whether the future of humanity lies, as Modi presented, with the youth and a sense of the positive value of human beings to build their own future, or if man is really nothing but an animal, as the British say, and therefore the herd should just be culled. That is the battle that is being waged, and colored revolutions have to be understood as an instrument of war in that policy battle.
So this will be the final question for this evening. On the subject of what people can and must do to respond to this crisis, Executive Intelligence Review has just released this beautiful and very important 375-page report called The New Silk Road Becomes the World Land Bridge, which in this report is an updated version of an earlier 1996 report on the Eurasian Land Bridge and the New Silk Road. The release of the report, which will be available for purchase on December 1st, comes as a very timely and crucial intervention, as it presents a war avoidance strategy in the face of the very dangerous situation that we've just been discussing. It presents an alternative to the collapsing transatlantic system by providing a new concept for the reconstruction of the global economy around a new concept for peace, which has already begun to come into being this year around the leadership of the BRICS nations. Now, in addition to this report by EIR, the LaRouche PAC will soon be releasing a complementary, shorter, 16-page mass pamphlet entitled Why the United States Must Join the BRICS, a New International Order for Mankind, which opens addressing the people of the United States. Americans must ask themselves, why have we been kept completely ignorant of the fact that a revolution has occurred among the majority of the peoples of this planet, who are now adopting an entirely new system of economy, which in fact represents the intended consequence and extension of the original principles which we fought for in our American Revolution against the British Empire? Why are we allowing Obama and his like to use us as willing tools of that dying empire today, spreading war and genocidal economic policies across the globe, while the leading nations of the planet are achieving a triumph for all mankind, based on the very principles which originally built our own republic? On the back cover of that pamphlet, and available right now on LaRouchepack.com, will be a petition entitled, "The United States and Europe Must Have the Courage to Reject Geopolitics and Collaborate with the BRICS," which ends with this call to action. "We therefore call upon the United States and Europe to abandon the suicidal geopolitical policies of the past, which led to the 2 previous world wars and are leading to a third, and to build a future for all humanity by readopting the principle of the Treaty of Westphalia, by basing foreign policy on the principle of the benefit of the other, which ended the 30 Years' War in Europe, and on John Quincy Adams' concept of a community of principle among sovereign nation-states. That is the only course coherent with the true nature of man as the only creative species. Any other course is based on a concept of man as an animal and leads to human extinction. As patriots of our own nations and as citizens of the world, we call on our fellow citizens and the leaders of our nations to have the courage to break the current cycle of escalating bestiality by accepting the generous offer to collaborate with the BRICS." So Dennis, I'd like to ask you to elaborate on the importance of the American people to do exactly what the title of this petition calls on them to do, to have the courage to reject geopolitics and to collaborate with the BRICS.
Mr. LaRouche said yesterday, in looking at the question of the BRICS and what's happening in the United States in this regard, he said, well, some in the United States are in the same spirit as those in South America who are joining the BRICS dynamic. And I think from the report we had earlier today in this panel discussion from New York City, we can certainly say that the spearhead of those some lies in New York in leading in that direction. Because it is going to take that kind of a unified concept of representing the interests of the totality of humanity and not simply partial interests of one country or one group, but rather an entire concept of a mission, of a nation, of a planet, of a species. That concept is what is required to actually bring this to fruition. And that is what we have to create or bring back into existence in the United States, in point of fact. Now, to look at where this stands at the moment, very briefly, I'd like to talk not so much about what's been happening in the BRICS nations over this recent period, but what the BRICS dynamic has unleashed in non-BRICS nations, precisely because they do represent, in point of fact, the interests of the entirety of humanity. If we could have the map that's been prepared on the screen, I'd like to show that to people. Incidentally, this map will be made available in the pamphlet that Megan was just describing that LaRouchePAC is about to publish. And this is a schematic world map indicating the world land bridge routes in green lines, basically. But it also has numbered off a whole series of projects and developments in different parts of the world that the BRICS nations and their allies have actually undertaken. And I'm certainly not going to go through all of these things, but if you just look overall, you can notice a pattern here. There's a whole bunch of these things going on between Russia and China on the New Silk Road, on railroad, on oil, on gas. India is involved, Southeast Asia, Korea, etc. And then look across the Pacific Ocean. All over South America, they've been drawn into this thing, from a transcontinental railroad involving Brazil. Argentina is involved in nuclear deals with Russia. China is involved in projects in Mexico, and so on and so forth. And there are some very significant developments going on as well in Africa, in particular in the nations of Egypt in the far north with the new Suez Canal, and in South Africa in the very far south. Excuse me. But what you'll also notice here is that the United States and Europe are largely absent from this process. And that's exactly the problem that we have to reverse. Now, people can look at this map in more detail later at their leisure in the LaRouche PAC pamphlet. But let me just give you a couple of examples of the kinds of things that are going on. Nicaragua is going to build an interoceanic canal with the aid of China across Nicaraguan territory, which will connect the Caribbean and therefore the Atlantic with the Pacific Ocean in what is in fact the new Panama Canal. And over much opposition, they are actually going to begin groundbreaking on December 22nd. In other words, shovels are in the ground, except it's not going to be shovels. It's going to be some more sophisticated equipment than that. But this is go. Now, Nicaragua is not a BRICS country, but it sure as heck is being dragged along by the momentum of this new world system being created. Then look at Egypt. In addition to the new Suez Canal, which I won't talk about now because we've discussed it before, Egypt has also announced a program related to the Suez Canal one of reclaiming 4 million acres of agricultural land. Now, mind you, Egypt is a country which outside of the Nile Valley is largely uncultivated, is land which is not being used for agricultural purposes. Well, they are going to reclaim 4 million acres for agriculture, and they will increase the self-sufficiency in food of the country from 60 to 75%. Then there's another project which we just heard about this week, which does involve one of the BRICS countries, which is China, which is that the world's longest rail line, or the longest rail trip, began already and was completed between China, Yiwu in China, all the way across the Eurasian continent through Europe to Madrid, Spain. This is 6,200 miles, 13,000 kilometers worth, and it was a cargo train, and it just simply shows the potential of this Eurasian land bridge. Now, it also shows some of the problems to be overcome, because it turns out that this train had to stop on 3 different occasions to transfer cargo from one train to another because of differences in the gauge of the rail lines, of the tracks. In other words, some were narrower and some were wider. And this was, by the way, an old British colonial trick that they used to make sure that there could be no interconnectivity, that there could be no integration, that rail lines served only to take minerals, which the British owned, on rail lines, which the British owned, to ports, which the British controlled, which were exported to markets so that the country could gain money to pay the British and Wall Street back. So the track had to be, because of the gauge question, had to be changed 3 times. Now, that's something that can be dealt with. There's technologies for this, besides simply building new maglev industrial corridors and other high-speed rail lines, which is really what's needed. There are things that can already be done to deal with this thing. And ironically, Spain, which was the destination of this train, is one of the leading countries in Europe, if it could get out from the death grip of the Troika and the IMF and Washington and the British Empire's policies, which has tremendous potential in terms of high-speed rail lines. In fact, if you look at the world as a whole, the #1 country with high-speed rail lines in the world is, excuse me, you won't be surprised to learn this, China, with 11,000 kilometers. And they, by the way, expect to have 50,000 kilometers by the year 2020. So, you know, that's a big leap, almost 5 times as much. But Spain is #2 with 2,600 kilometers to China's 11,000. That's not bad. And they have an industry that can do this. The way the Indian newspaper, The Hindu, described this new world's longest train trip was quite interesting. The headline was, "Yiwu to Madrid cargo train could touch 3 billion lives." And the point that they make is they correctly go through China's stated proposal to transform the old Silk Road into the New World Land Bridge. In other words, into a Silk Road economic belt, which in conjunction with Russia in particular, would directly affect a population on that route estimated in the range of 3 billion people. And that is what the Hindu describes as a bonding of the interests of Russia and China, and that this, in their concept, is a counter to President Obama's Asia pivot and war provocations. So I think that's an adequate appreciation of the enormity, both economically as well as strategically, of these kinds of developments and proposals that are going on. The question we have to ask ourselves, and I think it's the proper note on which to reflect as we conclude this webcast, is why have Americans allowed ourselves to have a government, Obama, but also the Congress, which has simply been unresponsive and worse to this proposal, which not only means the economic development of the planet, the proposals coming from the BRICS, but in fact is based on principles on which this nation itself was founded. The Alexander Hamilton principles that we were discussing earlier, that type of a credit system. And I think that if you look at the rampant prejudices in the population around China, around Russia, and so on and so forth, coupled with the opportunism and the pragmatism, the stinking, rotten, practical pragmatism that you get from congressmen, by and large in Washington, who in private will tell you one thing, which is, hey, that's not a bad idea, but in public will never be caught dead saying something like that because they would lose Wall Street money for their next election, or be facing a colored revolution of their own in their home district or something like that. But the population of the United States is so blissfully unaware of what the actual nature of the proposals are, is that it's sometimes shocking. And that is something that we intend to remedy. And we intend to remedy it by giving them a sense of what is actually the concept behind this thing. It's not for lack of facts. It's not for lack of information, although that is certainly lacking given what the media is doing. But that people have become so pessimistic by the control in this country exercised by Wall Street and the British, especially since the assassination of Kennedy, that they simply insist on blocking from their minds the very idea of what the Chinese in particular are now proposing, which is that you can and must have a win-win situation. The Chinese just held a conference in, excuse me, in Asia on security aspects. Besides their economic offers for win-win cooperation, the name of this security conference was Win-Win Cooperation, Build the Asian Community of Common Destiny. And when people hear this, they'll often say, oh, come on, no one really wants to benefit the other. No one really thinks that they should be looking for the benefit of the population as a whole, because they've really been led to believe and forgotten the very basis on which the country was founded in the first place. And they've been convinced by things like, well, you know, if you have only 4 bowls of porridge and there's 5 people, well, somebody's got to go without a bowl of porridge. And it's that type of idiotic examples which people accept as if it represented the nature of economy, which is nonsense. That exercise in lifeboat ethics, right, of, well, if there's 4 bowls of porridge and 5 people, somebody goes hungry. That is an extremely useful case study for the next time you are in a room and there are 4 people or 5 people and 4 bowls of porridge. That's what it's good for. But it is not good to analyze anything of importance about the world economy, because the human mind is something very different. Human mind makes bowls of porridge. The human mind creates new technologies. We invent new ways of producing more and better and creating longer lifespans with higher cultural levels for the population. And it's that underlying concept of man which is now flourishing with the BRICS and which we are recreating in this country, with the spearhead of this being in Manhattan and in New York City with what we're doing there. It is that which we intend and will succeed in bringing to the entire nation and from there to the rest of the world that's lacking, so that people do in fact join in and make sure that the new Silk Road becomes the new world land bridge.
Great, thanks a lot, Dennis. You know, with these lifeboat questions, the trick is getting you to take the question seriously. It doesn't matter how you answer it. It's sort of like saying, well, if we're going to commit suicide, how ought we ought to do it? You also know if you go to a meeting of economists and there's 4 bowls of porridge, you better look out. So I think this is today's broadcast has left us with plenty of things that we can do. We can look forward to the release of the World Land Bridge Report on December 1st. We can attend and participate in the New York event on December 13th and participate in New York and building for that. We can also contribute to LaRouchePAC.com, which I encourage everybody to do to the best of their ability. And that'll conclude our show for tonight. and we'll see you next week.